Chicago?
Yes.
1903.
February 22nd, 1903, at 4810 South Troop Street in the town of Lake, county of Cook, city of Chicago.
So, Joe, your parents had come here from Europe?
No, my mother was born here in Pennsylvania, in Morris Run, Pennsylvania, which is located in northwestern Pennsylvania, in the hard coal area. And my father, to the best of my knowledge, was born about 4 or 5 days after he arrived in America from Germany, from German Poland.
So then it was here in Chicago that you spent most of your life and your career?
All my life.
All your life.
That's right, with the exception of the traveling I did with racing. And naturally to all the various tracks all over the United States. But most of my activity was east of the Mississippi River. I very rarely went west of the Mississippi and participating in the races. And naturally, this was the more populated. The reason why that was the populations were here, and all of these so-called fairgrounds tracks were half-mile, and the state fair tracks were 1-mile tracks, and the county fair tracks were half-mile tracks. And they were flat, they were dirt, and they put calcium chloride on them in order to keep the dust down and what have you. And that's where all the racing was done prior to 1911 and 1912. Then after, it started to drift into Indianapolis.
So let's go back then to that first engine that you ever came in contact with at the tender age of, well, how old were you when you first received a toy engine, made out a steam engine?
I was about 6.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was around Christmas time, and my father was a very, very unusual man, so was my mother. They were very much in love with each other, a very compatible couple, if there ever was one, and he couldn't shower enough on his children. And I was the oldest, so consequently, he could give me gifts that he could share with me. He could play with me with some of these gifts. And he gave me that steam engine, and that's what made me interested in the mechanical phase of my life.
So what'd you do with that engine?
Wore it out.
Taking it apart,
Taking
putting
it
back
apart,
together?
putting it back together, that's right. Just wore it out, just trying to make it work a little better, a little faster, and what have you. And it was very, very fascinating because it was a practical working model. I mean, had a little flywheel on it. That thing was just flying, and had a little fuel tank that we filled with kerosene fuel, and it would run on that little tank of fuel for probably a half hour or more.
Wow. So then your second experience with things mechanical happened at what, you were 10, 11 years old?
I was about, the second was with the motorcycle, with the single-cylinder belt drive, Excelsior, and I would say I was about 14 years old.
14?
That's right.
How fast could a vehicle like that go?
Oh, probably 55, 60 miles an hour.
And when was the first time that you went to Indianapolis, to the Indianapolis 500?
My father took me there in 1911 for the first race. It evidently was...
You mean the first race at
Indianapolis? Well, the first race was in 1909, but it was, I'm talking about the brick track and when it got all the publicity and everything. Prior to that, it didn't get any publicity, and it was more local. But the first 500-mile race was in 1911, and it was on the brick track. And my father took me there by train. We did have an automobile. We had a Pope Toledo, but with tires the way they were, no roads. I mean, you were on dirt roads most of the time between Chicago and Indianapolis at that time, and if you got caught in the rain, you probably were stalled completely for a day or two. and in order to get there on time and what have you. And fortunately, the railroad tracks even today are right in front of the Speedway. The old main entrance to the Speedway is where these railroad tracks cross there. And that train stopped there, and all the passengers got off, and we had to walk through the main gate into the Speedway grounds.
Mm-hmm. So that was, can you remember who won that race that year?
Yes, Ray Harroun and the Marmon.
A Marmon automobile.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
The Marmon at that time was made in Indianapolis. And Ray Harroun won that race, and at a remarkably high speed, too. I believe it was about 86 miles an hour, a little faster than 86 miles an hour at that time.
You averaged 86 miles an hour?
That's right.
Is that, tell me about, what they call the track then, the Brickyard? Or?
They called it the Brickyard. Its running surface was, this is before asphalt, before cement was as readily and as easily and inexpensively laid. And they laid this brick down just like you would build a house. And just build that laid brick for that 2.5 miles all around that track.
Mm-hmm.
Millions of bricks.
Mm-hmm. So then you spent your youth going to Indianapolis with your father.
He took me there every year. I tried and I persuaded and begged him to take me there, and I attended every race there from 1911 to until World War I. And then there was a lull there. They did not run for 2 years.
During the war?
During the war. Mm-hmm. And then, naturally, I was old enough to go there myself after that, after World War I. And I started, I was a fan, a race fan, and an observer until after World War I. And then I started my racing career with building a car out of some Miller parts that were made in California. And the person that, at that time when you wanted to buy a Miller, now I'm talking about the era of 1922. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted a car, a Miller, to be delivered for the 1922 race, you had to order it a year or two prior to the race, and I believe and I understand that you had to pay about a half of the cost of the car. And at that time, those cars were priced at $10,000, which means you had to put a $5,000 deposit on it, and they started to build your car. And they built a total car. I mean, ready to race. When it was delivered, you could take it right to the Speedway and start running with it.
I'll be darned, that was a lot of money in those days.
Yes, it was. The rear drive, the rear drives, and that's all that was available at that time. They started to build the front wheel drives a year or two later, and they were $5,000 more expensive. They were $15,000 for the front drive, $10,000 for the rear wheel drive. Mm-hmm. And this person in Chicago that ordered this rear wheel drive, a man by the name of Fusco, Joe Fusco. He was a young man, and I don't know whether, I believe he wanted to drive the car himself in the next race. And he had an accident of some kind, and he lost one of his legs. And
the racing or?
No, in some kind of a accident of some kind. I didn't know the man too well. He was called to my attention that he had ordered this car, and he requested his deposit or a part of his deposit back, and I don't think that the Miller Company and he agreed, so he took as much of the car, of his car that he ordered with the deposit for the amount of his deposit. In other words, he took $5,000 worth of the car, which consisted of a frame, the whole front system, the front axle, the spindles, the steering arms, and the cowl frame, and the springs, all 4 springs on it, and I think a part of the steering mechanism. At any rate, he took that part of the car, and a friend of mine called to the attention that the car was available and at a very reasonable price. So I made arrangement to meet this man, Fusco, and I purchased that Miller car from him.
And that was your first race car?
That was my first race car. And after I purchased that, I built it up here in Chicago. I hired and worked myself in putting the car together. And where I lived at that time, at 1300 West 52nd Street in Chicago, there was a metal shop on a block away on 51st and Ada. And the people that operated that shop were very skilled. They were Germans, very skilled. Their name was Zeilner.
Zeilner?
Zeilner, Z-E-I-L-N-E-R. And they had the Zeilner metal shop there. And, of course, most of their work at that time was in building construction. Rain gutters, downspouts, and various outdoor metal requirements in the building industry. And I went there and I asked whether they would be interested in making some tanks for me and part of the radiator tank and what have you, and they came over and visited with me and saw the car, and they said yes, they would be interested. So they made all of the internal metal parts, and then I had to have a body made. And when I started to construct the body, I had that done by an automotive body shop on 23rd and Indiana Avenue. And they put the body on. They designed and built a body for it. I designed the body, but they, according to we were a little off on the tail section. I wasn't quite satisfied, but it was very presentable, and it was equal to what you would find at Indianapolis on the cars that came right from the Miller shop. And at that time, I met Art Chevrolet several years prior to finishing my car, and I called him on the phone in Indianapolis. I told him that I was finishing a car, and I'd like to put a Fronty Ford engine in it. Well, he told me, he said he'd be happy and glad to work with me, and invited me to come to Indianapolis. Well, the Fronty Ford, you bought a Ford, a Model T Ford, cylinder block and underpin and what have you, and the Fronty Ford was the cylinder head and the carburation and the ignition system and what have you. So I bought the Ford parts here in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, I got that at a car dealer, a very early car dealer on 52nd and Ashland Avenue. I think it was the Sherman Ford Agency, if I'm not mistaken.
So you were talking to Mr. Chevrolet about using a Ford?
No, a Fronty Ford.
Fronty Ford.
That's right. And then when I went to Indianapolis, well, then I got the Fronty cylinder head, which is what they were selling. It was their design.
That was their design, Chevrolet.
That's right. And you would use that cylinder head, and you would naturally have to use the pistons in order to take advantage of the combustion chamber design. And I got his Fronty head, and I put it on there, and I got the Siltil magneto that I used at that time, and a Zenith carburetor, and put an engine together. And I drove the car. At that time, I was driving the car, and I joined an organization that were racing at several tracks here in the Chicago area. At the Ruby racetrack, which was a mile, and at the Crown Point racetrack in Indiana, which was a half mile, And then we had another half-mile track in Chicago on the north side, the North Shore Polo Grounds, where they played polo and had a half-mile track around this polo field. And then we had another mile track in Wisconsin, in the Milwaukee area, and we had another mile track at the Springfield Fairgrounds in Springfield, Illinois. So we had a lot of racing tracks, and we could race every week, weather permitting, all season. I mean, we could start in late April, early May, and we could race until November. And we did.
Backtrack a little bit. Okay, Joe. Okay, Joe, it's very interesting then. You went from a motorcycle to building your own race car, the Miller car, with the parts you got in conversations with Mr. Chevrolet and parts that you got from California.
That's right.
And at that time you were a young man still. You were in your late teens, were you? Or?
Yes, I was probably 20 years old. No.
Okay, so Joe, in those early years, before the Indianapolis 500, and racing was centered pretty much around the Chicago area.
Well, the Roby track was the principal track. Even the Indianapolis participants would come to Roby and run at least one race prior to the Indianapolis 500-mile race. They'd come from California and from all over the United States, and the promoters of the Roby track, which was a very good, one of the prominent and best one-mile dirt race tracks, and come here and race at Roby prior to going to Indianapolis, and that would give them an opportunity to check their cars out and what have you, and set up some of their requirements for performance, and then they'd go on to Indianapolis. And we, our Central Race Driver boys, would have an opportunity to compete with them and compare our performances. Naturally, they were handicapped because their cars were designed for that 2.5-mile track, and our cars were designed for the sharper turns that you have on a 1.5-mile track, so they were at a disadvantage. But there were times when they'd outperform us because of their higher straightaway speeds.
So their wheelbases on yours were probably smaller than theirs?
Ours were shorter cars. Our wheelbases were from 90 to 94 inches, and theirs were about, at that time, about 101. Their wheelbase was 101 inches.
So how popular was racing then in the Chicago area? I mean, this is a long time ago.
Packed grandstands. Always a
How many
sellout.
racing cars would you say, racers would you say were active then in the
There
association?
were, I didn't see all of them, but from the information I got, there were 101 racing cars in the Chicago area. Now that area could be 100 miles either way, and up in from Wisconsin, and as far, maybe, well, the race, some of the cars from the south would come from even Indianapolis, dirt track cars.
So we're talking 1919. You were a young man. You built your first automobile, a Miller one, a race car. And tell me something about that car. First of all, where is it now?
Oh, golly, that car is gone. We lost that car in a crash at Detroit. Al Waters relieved me. I was driving the car, and of course making a trip with a Model T flatbed truck is the way I hauled a car, and one of my mechanics and myself were the only two of us, and we had to drive from Chicago to Detroit, and got there the morning of the race after driving all night with a Model T, 30 miles an hour, 35 miles an hour, and I was tired, and but the car was performing very well, and our setup was very compatible with the requirements of the Speedway at that time. And when I made my first fuel pit stop, Al Waters was in the pit. His car was out, and he was driving a Miller, a new Miller, and he was from the Chicago area, and I knew him, and I raced with him. And a man by the name of Heinley, an insurance man who owned the car, told me, he said, Joe, your car can win this race if you let Al relieve you as a driver. He's fresh and what have you. You drove all night. Why don't you let him jump in there and win the race for you? And I did. I realized that that was what was required to win the race, so I let Al jump in the car. And unfortunately, on the second lap, after he got in the car, he had a heart attack. Oh. And he lost the car. He lost the car coming out of the far turn and coming on the home stretch straightaway. And he just drifted into the fence and caught that fence and tore the fence off its foundation, and it fell on top of him. And it fractured his skull, and when we got to him, a part of his brain was visible coming out from the fracture and the crack in his head. He died immediately. And the car was totaled. I mean, he totally destroyed the car.
It wasn't your time.
Well, that was one of them things, and you can expect things like that in life and in racing. And of course, racing was a little more hazardous then than it is now. Your equipment, your tires, and when you stop to think what we did with tire development alone, I mean, it was, take a look at some of the old cars. They used to have 8-10 spare tires on them. They'd have tires in the front fender wells, and they had tires on the back and carried tires on the roof, because you were fortunate if you could go over 100 miles without having some kind of a tire failure at that time. And look at what you do today. You're dismayed and you're dissatisfied if you don't get 40, 50,000 miles on a set of tires.
Well, we can thank that to those pioneers in racing.
Well, the development was done then with all the tire companies, all of them. I mean, there wasn't a tire company in existence that didn't do some of their development and engineering work and materials and in design and construction and what have you on the racetracks. Yes.
It applies to across the board everything about the automobile, from spark plugs
well,
to tires.
I would say, in my opinion, the automobile was the foundation of almost anything mechanical in the world, because the airplane was designed after the automobile, and the engines and the materials and what have you that were used in the first aircraft were fundamentally and originally used in the earlier automobiles, which were probably as many as 6-8 years before the airplane were, and the aircraft engines were. So the aircraft engine inventors and designers and builders were using whatever was developed in automobiles at that time, and using it very well and very successfully in the development of aircraft.
So you spent a lot of the time during the late teens, 1919 and the 20s and the 30s racing, or?
All the time. Raced every week, and raced, well, from Springfield, Milwaukee, and until 1927. And in 1927, Mike Boyle, who was the business agent of the Electrical Workers Union here in Chicago, was interested in manufacturing a new design of valve, automobile valve. And they were flat seated. They did not have an angular seat. like you have in your present automobiles, but was right on top. Well, originally, you had a 30 to 45 degree angle on your seats at the original engines. I'm talking way back. And this Boyle, whomever and however, started to build these by putting them flat right on top, which meant that you were using the full area of your intake port rather than sloping it and reducing or choking it, and they thought they'd get better performance that way. Well, Mike had a little plant on 59th and 8th Street, and he was manufacturing these valves. Well, I got acquainted with him, and he asked me if I'd do a little development work for him with my race cars, with my race engines, and I consented. So he was my first sponsor. My first car was the Boyle Valve Special at that time.
When you say your first car, you mean for Indianapolis?
No, my first car on the dirt.
Period.
This is long before Indianapolis. I didn't go to Indianapolis until 1933.
To race?
With my car to race. Two of my drivers, and I was extremely lucky, fortunate, and successful in dirt track racing, because I have a car here that I believe the records will reveal that it had won more races and had set more track records and world records before 1930 than any car that ever raced any place in the world.
That car exists still?
It's here.
In this plant?
It's in my collection here.
We're going to have to look at that car at some point.
Well, I have it here, and it's a very unusual car, and what's extremely unusual about it is that I designed the engine that's in it. I mean, the total engine. That was no longer a Fronty Ford. It was a Lencki engine, a four-cylinder engine.
Did you have your own patterns made?
Oh, yes, definitely. I had the patterns and started with a sharp pencil and a drawing board and a clean sheet of paper.
And build it all the way to the top.
That's right. Total.
Is there anything in that car that you could say that is still in use today in technology?
Not some of the materials, but that car, or I should say that engine, had the first X-rayed metal in the world in it. I had a sister who was a registered nurse and worked with a group of doctors on Jackson Boulevard in Chicago here during the boom building industry time here in Chicago when Bill Thompson was the mayor. And I asked her, she used to work at an X-ray machine days every day, and I asked her if it was possible to interest the people that were making these X-ray machines to see if we could make an X-ray of metal. And it interested them. They said, well, nobody's ever did that, and what's his purpose, what's his reason? And she said, well, if there were any defects in the materials and the forging and what have you, it'd show up in an X-ray if you could do that. Well, when they made the arrangements, I went to their laboratory with some of my steering parts, and this was about 1932. 1932 is when we did this, and I went to their lab, and lo and behold, yes, they could take an X-ray of metal, but they could only penetrate 4 inches. And I said, well, that's wonderful. I said, that's 8 inches. And the laboratory man there said, what do you mean? I said, 4 inches. No, I said, when we turn it over 180 degrees, we'll take another shot from the other side, we go 8 inches.
That's right.
And he said, you're right, you're
It's
right.
very logical.
So it was wonderful.
Is this the car?
So the difference is that they prepared them for automobile racing. They put this calcium chloride on, which they had to remove when the horses went on, But they had to put it on for the automobiles to hold the dust down, so that you didn't smother the people up in the grandstand and didn't bury them in dust. But other than that, so this horse nape came, and we put on the show, and I don't want to exaggerate. It's possible that my car won that race, but if it didn't, it finished second.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible that it won it. My memory ain't serving me to prove or disprove. But at that time, Mike Boyle, he set it up, and I was a participating race driver at that time, and unfortunately I still have my pin, my 3A first racing pin, 1927, which allowed me up until now. I'm still qualified to go to Indianapolis and sit in a race car and to test it. My qualifications still are in effect. Yes, sir. And after we got through with there, then we made our next step and start preparing for Indianapolis. Well, I wasn't ready because of the equipment, but two of my boys were ready. Louis Schneider, who set a lot of records on half-mile and mile tracks and my dirt car, won the 1931 500-mile race, and I was his coach. And Billy Arnold, another one of my pupils, won the 1930 500-mile race at Indianapolis. In fact, Billy Arnold did it in a very unusual way. He started setting records in his first race. Well, I didn't get there until 1933. And as we discussed before, I had the first X-rayed medal, and when I got to the Speedway at that time, I went one step further. I worked with the inventor of the first disc brake, a man by the name of Milan. Well, Milan come to Chicago with his development, his disc brake, to some of the financiers here in Chicago, and interested them, and they were a part of my sponsors. I had more sponsors in my racing career than anybody that ever raced a racing car.
We're talking about the first disc brake ever.
In the world, the first disc brake.
Okay.
It's here.
Okay.
And
what did you have up there? Okay, Joe, so we're talking about you're going to Indianapolis. Some of your cars won there?
My first race, as I say, I had these two drivers of mine, my pupils that I coached, Billy Arnold and Louis Schneider, who won Arnold in 30 and Louis in 31. And I didn't get there till 1933. And one of my sponsors, the Borg-Warner Corporation, they're still large and they're in business, making automotive parts, clutches, transmissions, gears, and what have you. Very well acquainted. They sponsored me, and together with a dozen more. I mean, I had the Bird Piston Ring Company and Blue Crown and Spark Plugs and Republic Steel and many of them. I mean, I was very, very fortunate. I was lucky. Must have been a pretty good salesman, too. So anyway, when I got to Indianapolis with this car, my pupils are there, and they had won the 31 and the 3,500-mile race, and I had a driver by the name of Sawyer, Johnny Sawyer, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, from West Dallas. And I had my little four-cylinder engine, my Lencki engine, but I did not have a car. So his stepfather said, "Joe, why don't you and John go to the 500-mile race?" I said, "I've got a very good reason." I said, "It's financial." He said, "Well, we won't worry too much about that." Lo and behold, the man bought the very finest and the best two-man Miller race car, and the last Miller race car that Harry Miller built. Last two-man car. I put my little four-cylinder engine in there. Johnny Sawyer, who never drove the track, but was excellent on the dirt tracks, in particular on the miles, And we're there a couple of days, and financially we were pinched. And Louis Schneider, one of my drivers, comes over to visit with me because they set us up in the foreign garages. They didn't even put us up in the main garage area at the Speedway. They put us in the foreign garage area where we were all by ourselves, and it was very compatible and very well done for us because we could use it. We could use the seclusion and all of this that we needed with our nervous tension and what have you. So Louis comes over and he said, what's the matter? Are you afraid to take that thing out there and shake it down? You're afraid it's going to fall apart? And I said, no. I said, we don't have any rubber. And he said, well, we'll take care of that. So he goes over to, he said to my brother Ed, who was one of my mechanics, he said, throw 6 wheels in the trunk of my car. And he's got a fancy roadster there and that the automobile companies furnished for the winter. And he took them to Firestone and had them mounted with new tires and what have you. And we put them on that night. And the next day, I told Johnny, I said, Johnny Sawyer, I said, we're going out and you're going to warm this thing up tomorrow evening. We're going to wait until everybody else is through. And I said, the track will be shut down at about 7 o'clock. So I said, we'll be prepared and you be here and ready to get out on the track at about 6 o'clock. So we're in the foreign garages, and a very famous man, a man by the name of Ed Steinbach, who was an excellent announcer, a race announcer, very well known. Of all people, he wanted to ride my car as a riding mechanic. So he's with Johnny Sawyer.
The second man is the riding mechanic.
That's right. And he's in the car. So we got it warm, we're all warmed up. The sun is coming down. Nobody on the track. We got my engine all warmed up. We got the whole car warmed up, and it's ready. So we start the engine. Johnny drove over from the outside of the track. All the other cars were on the inside. My car was on the outside in the foreign garages. And over the hump in the southwest turn. He gets out on the track, 3 or 4 laps, feel the track out, and I give him the signal. Johnny dipped his foot in. The winning cars in the 2 previous races, their top speed was 107 miles an hour. Johnny's first warm-up lap was 112. He run 4 or 5 laps at that speed, and I give him the signal, and he come in, and he pulls in the garage, and we lock the doors, and we're sitting up in the grandstand. It wasn't but about 15, 20 minutes later, and there was a parade of cars with Pop Meyer, the general manager of the Speedway, leading the parade. They had the spark plug men, the tire men, and they were all in the parade. Where's that car? Where's that car? Where's that car that was just out on the track? My brother said, well, it's in the garage. Well, who's in charge of that car? He said, my brother. He's sitting up in the grandstand. Call him down here. And I come on down, and Pop looks at me, and he said, what's that car doing here? I said, well, that's where you put it. I said, you're the manager of the Speedway. I said, all I did was turned in an entry, and I said, we were told to put it here. That car has to be removed from here immediately. It doesn't have the police protection. It doesn't have the fire protection that it requires. And I want that car moved just as quick as you can over the inside of the track. And then Louis Varmer, the Bosch man, come over, and he looked. And I didn't have a Bosch magneto, and he said, what's that magneto doing on there? If I ain't that a Bosch, I said, because you didn't put one on there. And the spark plug band, and all the rest of them looked at it. So we got over on the other side of the track. And we had a terrific introduction in our first show at the Speedway. Everybody knew who we were, and everybody knew why we were there. And it was...
So how'd the race go that year?
Well, I had no starter, and you had to start cranking. And when he made his first pit stop, we couldn't start the car. We tried to start it, and we couldn't And we didn't push it 5 feet, and it started and drove it into the garage. But we had to start it either cranking or with a starter. And we had no starter on the engine. The engine is here. We have the engine here.
You know, that points to a very important aspect of car racing right there. Okay, that's what we get into. Joe, let's talk about the relationship between automobile racing and today's modern car. What does it contribute, or has it?
Well, in my opinion, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is the cradle of all automotive development in the world. Not only here in the United States, but in the world. Because if you follow and study its progression of improvement from 1911 until 1941, just before the war started, World War II, you will find that the development programs there just followed from one to the other. And it was not only in speed or just ordinary performance, it was in order to qualify to start in them races. The program started in the 30s and the early 30s and progressed right until 1941. During my entire career, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is my school. It's my college. That's where I got my degree.
And what's your degree?
My SP degree, Superior Performance. And that's where you had to get it. And it took me 10 years to qualify and get that degree. Now, I'm not trying to tell or say that they do serve you with any degrees of any kind, but that's what it did for Joe Lencki. That's what I used it for and what it did for me. Consequently, we started with the material aspect of it and the metals that we used. And after we got through with the foundation, the metals, then we got into the forming and the design of those metals. Before you can begin to design an engine, in my opinion, the first thing you have to know is what kind of fuel are you going to use in that engine. And after you have that information, then you design the harness for the energy in that fuel. And the harness for the energy in that fuel is an internal combustion reciprocating engine, such as you use in an automobile or in an aircraft today. Now, the higher output, they've moved away from the internal combustion reciprocating engines. However, the automobile and the smaller and the more in-use aircraft engines are still reciprocating engines. So consequently, the automotive industry and the aircraft engine industry complied, and they were as helpful and as cooperative and as financially able to further any progression of developments at the Speedway.
All of this contribute to safety.
Not necessarily to safety. It also contributes, and unfortunately, the war stopped the program. 1941. Now, the car that won the 500-mile race in 1939 did the 500 miles on 37.5 gallons of fuel. And today, they're using 250 gallons of fuel to run the 500 miles. What's the performance differential? 110 miles an hour when we were running on 37.5 gallons, and now 230 miles an hour, double the speed. However, it's not a thrill show. It wasn't a thrill show in 1941. Unfortunately, when we started the racing after the war, it became a speed contest. And all of these rules and regulations as to kinds of fuel, what kind of fuel they wanted to try to find substitutes or find means of improving on the fuels, and the amount. And it was a progression of development. And now, since 1946, it's a thrill show. It's a speed contest. And consequently, the greatest improvements that were made are more aeronautical than what they are automotive, because your development now at these 225-mile-an-hour speeds are already airborne speeds. The
so
average
they're
aircraft,
talking about design, automobile design.
That's right.
It's like an airplane wing moving out on that field.
The entire detail and the shape and what have you of an aircraft is now very, very related to a racing car that's traveling at 225 miles an hour. One of your most principal challenges is to keep that car on the ground and keep it an automobile and not turn it into an aircraft, because it will become airborne, and the average aircraft, small aircraft, becomes airborne at speeds that are only 1/3 of that 230 miles an hour. So consequently, the shape of the car and the shape of the body and the back end of it, the front end of it, all is airflow control to keep the car from getting in the grandstand on somebody's lap in the audience. And if and when we start changing them rules and regulations, probably we'll catch up with one of the most hazardous and soon becoming dangerous conditions in the world today, and that's pollution control. We have millions of automobiles now that are discharging hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide that we human beings cannot tolerate. And we're doing that in volumes that are becoming dangerous. And the solution is simple.
What is the solution, Joe?
Reduce the number from 225 million to 100 million, and you cut the pollution down in half.
Automobiles.
That's right. And aircraft, too. I mean, the polluters are up there in the altitude. We don't have to wait. We send them up there to pollute.
But
we deliver to them.
That doesn't seem to be a very practical solution in a commercialized world.
There are, and I have been, and we were working on them things prior to the war. And after the war, with a change in management, a change in the governing and the people that were governing and setting up the rules for the race after the war, changed this from a practical, desirable development program into a speed test. And yes, they did a marvelous job. There's no question about it. Increased and doubled the speed. However, we did failed at one of our most requirements, and that is fuel economy.
So fuel economy and pollution are major problems today.
They are very, very related. They are related. They're directly related. Because the more fuel you burn, the more pollution you discharge. And the more you are creating this condition that we have. We used to have 4 seasons a year, and now we're having 4 seasons a week. Look at it. Look out your windows and see what's happening.
Is this what prompted your interest in oil?
Well, yes, but
So, Joe, your interest in solving pollution problems goes way back before the war?
Oh, yes, yes. It's related with performance to a high degree, because the greater the amount of pollution created by an internal combustion engine in operation, the more performance effect it has. and it reduces the performance. The performance of an internal combustion or any engine, the more it's controlled and the more it is economically, the better, and less costing, less polluting. So consequently, as I said before, you can design an engine. You have to know what the fuel is going to be. And then you design a combustion chamber and an engine to be compatible with the requirements.
Let's talk about your product and how it functions in fighting pollution.
Well, if you go back and you check what we do at the Speedway, in my instance, at 8 o'clock in the morning we get in the garage at the Speedway in Indianapolis, which is my alma mater, my college, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We would warm the engine up. We would warm the entire engine up. We'd warm the oil up and the engine to 180 degrees before we started the engine. Doing that presently. My car here, one of my cars here, the latest car, has the heaters on it, electric heaters. We don't warm it up by starting the engine cold and allowing it to
warm itself
and damage some of the working parts because it don't operate at that temperature. The operating temperature is 180 degrees or a little warmer, below 212, the boiling point of water. So consequently, I, in my instance, would warm the entire engine up and we would start our test at the track about race time, 11 o'clock. That's when I'd start running. Before we start running, we'd call the airport and find the barometric, the velocity, the temperature, the barometric, and all of the necessary air conditions, and mark that all down and take them records down. And then when you start your car up, you know what the temperatures are and what have you, and I keep that in my records. Then we go out and we run probably 100 miles, 150, maybe 200 miles. Then we return to the garage with the car. After we return to the garage with the car, we let it cool off, and believe it or not, we remove the engine, tear it completely apart, and examine every piece in it after 150, 200 miles. Compare that with what you do with an automobile engine today. Some of them are in service for 50, 60, 70,000 miles, and they haven't been taken apart. So consequently, when we inspect these parts, and we have the barometric and the working information that we need, we record all of that, put the engine together, and the next day we start all over again. Racing time, 11 o'clock in the morning. Car's all warmed up, call the airport, get the weather conditions, and start another test. After the test is over, 100, 200 miles, back to the, tear it down again, completely, and inspect and record everything you find.
So, Joe, Churchill's Downs has its mint julep, and I see you're sitting right next to a Speedway cocktail. What's the difference?
Well, we found...
Yeah.
We've got probably another 15 minutes with this lady.
Okay. Yeah. Joe, my question was, Churchill's Downs, the famous racetrack, has its mint juleps, and I notice that sitting next to you is a Speedway cocktail. What's the difference?
Well, strange as it may seem, the scientists and the renowned engineers of the era that would congregate at Indianapolis every year for the month of May, men like Tom Edison, Henry Ford, Harvey Firestone,
people that you knew,
the Chryslers, and what have you, I know that it even affected their curiosity. Why? Why are they, what's the purpose? They only go out there and run, what are they finding when they only go out there and run 100 miles? And the race is 500 miles. And, well, it was important. The most important thing was to get the barometric and get the air conditions. That was the most important. Second, by doing it that way, we did not destroy. We checked minutely from the time the engine was first started what the requirement was to control the wear and the various byproduct, so-called carbon deposits in the combustion chamber and on the valves. And a very significant view of it is this valve here is an exhaust valve out of a passenger car. It's probably been in use for about 60,000 miles. Take a look at that.
That's all it takes to build that much.
That's right. And this is the way it appeared, the way it was before, when the engine was new. You can imagine.
Well, you say
taking the engine down, and after 100 miles or so, and inspecting it. And you want to start there?
Right.
You want to start at that point?
Yeah, go right from that point.
Okay.
Go
Is you
ahead.
ready now?
Now.
Our reason for running 100 miles and tearing down the engine completely was for the purpose of checking minutely a condition that prevails in all automobiles and aircraft reciprocating engines, is that you start this way and you have to control and get all of your information before it builds up to this amount progressively. You don't learn anything unless you know the period of time it takes. Well, what causes that condition? Why do you have that carbon buildup? The reason is why is because ordinarily with your automotive engines, yes, it would be ridiculous to go out for one day's trip and then have somebody tear the complete engine down and inspect it like we did our racing engines. However, we should find a means and ways of controlling these buildups, and the only way you could do it was to, one, find a reason for it. Then after you find a reason for it, find some materials that are related and compatible to at least control, if not stop, control and to prevent any abnormal amount.
Let's look at those valves again, Joe.
Consequently, I started, and the aspect of chemistry in it, and I found a reason. The reason was high temperatures that were tolerated and that would not damage or prevent operation, however, were very destructive. And what were they? To control the temperatures at the working surfaces of the various parts. And people have no idea, the operators have no idea how important it is and how quickly your performance can be reduced and affected, because those working surfaces are controlled by manufacturing controlled tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch. That's finer than a human hair. And consequently, I felt that I have to find the means and ways of developing a product or a material that we could use to protect these working surfaces. And I went into that development project and came up with this, a very, very fine lubricant, and one that would not only separate these working surfaces and create a separate layer of lubrication between those working surfaces, but also control any deposits and control destruction, and not have to remove and overhaul or what have you at intervals that would be very expensive and what have you. So we got this Speedway cocktail, and we found that it become effective after about 3 or 4 years of development. And
when did you start developing the Speedway cocktail?
I would say that very shortly after I got to the Speedway. I think by second, third year down there, I immediately started. I would say the second year.
1933?
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's right, 1933. And as we progressively developed it, we found that we could astonishingly affect and provide this. How? We not only had a separate lubricant, a separating lubricant between the working surfaces, but one that penetrated and energized the metal itself.
It seeped into the metal.
That's right. It saturated the metal, the pores of the metal. Consequently, if and when you started up an engine that was not warmed, or in weather conditions where the temperature variables would be so high and be so destructive, it controlled them to a high degree. And what happens? Just like I said, this carbon buildup, and you have to protect from having
Let me see that again, Joe. Just hold it up a minute. That, how many miles would you say that ran?
This from this to this, and about 60,000 miles.
60,000 miles.
That's right. But you can imagine what that does to performance and to pollution, because your fuel-air ratio and what have you is already destroyed, because it's set up for this, and you have this choking effect of this. So you have no control. You lost control.
So as far back as the early 1930s, American automobiles that raced were using Speedway cocktail to penetrate these very kind of valves.
Oh, yes. There was only a select few, because the only cars that were equipped with this material were sponsored by my sponsors. Like the Bird Piston Ring Company, it had 4 or 5 different owners and cars in the contest, in the race. I only had 1 or 2 cars. We had 4 or 5 cars. Consequently, there were 3 or 4 different car owners, 3 or 4 different drivers. But my arrangement with my sponsors wasn't only to win a contest, a speed contest in the race, but to help develop and to try to do whatever I could to protect the performance of the materials that they were paying me to present to the public and show their superiority in performance operations.
Let's talk a little bit more. Okay.
A very prominent newspaper man named it.
Yeah, we'll start again.
Okay, Ronan?
What?
Okay. So you changed the name from Speedway Cocktail to Lencki.
Yes, I did, because when we called it Speedway Cocktail, for Johnny Jenkins' satisfaction and what have you, and it was only used at the Speedway, there was no reason to change it. I mean, it had no relationship with its title or its name.
So Johnny Jenkins was the editor for the Chicago Daily News.
He was the automotive editor of the Chicago Daily News, and he was the same Johnny Jenkins that finished 5th or 6th in the 1912 or 1913 500-mile race, and I think the following year he finished 6th or 7th. And he ended his career in automobile racing and then went into newspaper editing and newspaper reporting. But I changed the name to Lenkite. And the Lenkite name was put on there for my father's sake. Lencki, Lenkite.
And
what
that
it
way
was,
they would not confuse it with an
with
actual
Speedway
drink.
cocktail, so that people wouldn't think that we're drinking in the garage area and having a drink.
Would you have mint juleps?
And all this Lencki does is just protects the working surfaces with a layer of a lubricant that does not drain off. Energizes, why? Because it impregnates the very pores of the metal, and it keeps the metals energized so that they don't get the deposits, the byproduct deposits, so-called carbon deposits, like they do without it. And one of the most important parts that it plays is in this part of an automobile. Now this is a camshaft. This part of the automobile has more to do with the performance of an internal combustion engine, reciprocating engine, than any other part of the engine, because it controls the amount of fuel and air that is introduced into the combustion chamber, and it also relieves it because there are two of these camshafts, an intake cam that lets the fuel and air in, and an exhaust cam that lets it out, and has a great deal to do in our air pollution control today. Because if the cam, either by design or by so-called carbon buildup or by timing effect with a lack of lubrication, it must open and it must close at the very precise time. And if it stays open a little too long, it not only affects the performance, but it affects the pollution of the engine.
That particular camshaft there, is that something that you designed?
Yes, I am a very, very dear close friend of mine, Ed Winfield, who also was the inventor of the Winfield carburetor, and we used his carburetor for years exclusively until we started to use fuel injection on some of our engines. But we used his carburetor exclusively for 20 years at the Speedway. Well, Ed, when he made my cams, the surface of the cam and the duration periods of their opening and closing are so different and so precise that he had to design a new camshaft grinder. I don't know, but I feel that it's going to be difficult to have somebody else make a camshaft like these, and I have several of them for my engines, without Ed Winfield doing it. I don't believe that anybody can reproduce and copy what Ed did. So consequently, I'm going to have to be satisfied till I can find somebody that can duplicate his work. Now, the other thing that we have is the pattern work on the engines. The pattern work on the engines is very important because it controls the wall thicknesses of the crankcases, cylinder blocks, and what have you. And I found some pattern makers in California by the name of Wismar. And when I first met with them and started to do business with them and have them produce and make my patterns for me, I found that these people were artistic wood carvers.
The patterns are made out of wood.
They are, ordinarily, they're made out of soft wood so that you can make them faster and what have you. My patterns, which I have, were made out of select Philippine mahogany. And I told them, don't spare the horses. Price don't enter into this at all. I want this to be perfect, and they did. And I have the patterns here for my six-cylinder engines. I have two of them. I have a hemispherical combustion chamber in one and I have a pent roof combustion chamber at the other. The hemispheric combustion chamber has 2 valves per cylinder, and the pent roof has 4 valves per cylinder. For some purposes, 4 valves per cylinder are more effective. However, I believe that what we're going to have to do in our new designing and our elaboration in the arts of internal combustion is go back to 2 valves. And the camshaft is going to play a very large part in the pollution control, together with the kind and the amount of fuel and the compression ratio. It's a chain reaction and has to be followed up. And my first introduction in the effect that carburation and camshaft design was when I was a boy, about 15 years old. I attended a meeting of the Society of Automotive Engineers here in Chicago, near the Loop, where Fred Duesenberg of the famous Duesenberg brothers was the principal speaker. And believe it or not, 70 years ago, 75 years ago, Fred Duesenberg was talking about fuel efficiency and fuel control. He said, we have to design and build engines, and we have to produce and we have to make fuels that will allow not less than 50 miles to the gallon.
That was
65 years ago.
65
Check
years
the
ago.
records and find from the SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, that you'll find that Fred Duesenberg, the principal speaker at that time, was talking about air pollution and fuel control. And they were competitors of mine and very, very good friends at the 500-mile race in Indianapolis. We went to the same school together, only they were my instructors. I was not their instructors. And I learned from them, because Tom Edison, Henry Ford, all of these people that used to congregate there were my instructors. Why did they congregate?
So we're talking about names like Firestone, Duesenberg, people that you learned from.
Well, Fred Duesenberg, as I say, he attended this SAE meeting, and he was talking about pollution. Now, one of the things that attracted my attention and attracted me to that speedway were the various people, the renowned people in the world. I mean, you know, the 2 boys that made and designed and built the first aircraft. They were there.
The Wright brothers?
The Wright brothers. Yeah, sure they were there. Why? They had to have engines. Where are you going to get the right engines and the safest engines? You got to go where they use them, where they know what they're talking about, what they're doing. So the Wright brothers came there, and the Ford came there, and the Duesenbergs came there, and the Packard people came there, and the Stutz brothers came there. I met them all. They were my instructors. And my questions was to them, okay, why the Indianapolis Motor Speedway? Why did these people congregate there? The greatest attraction and the highest amount of people assembling to view and to observe something, even way back then. I mean, right today, there's more people go to Indianapolis during the month of May and congregate there than any place in the world. On race day, they have over 300,000 people there. Compare that with any sporting event or any place in the world today. There is no comparison, but they're there. Why, when I was a boy, did they do that? Simple. No radio, no television, no telephones, and if you wanted to meet anybody, if you wanted to exchange ideas, and if you wanted to get any knowledge, you had to go to Indianapolis. And this little boy from Chicago found that out early in life when his daddy took him there and said, if you want a good teacher, don't read a book, go to the author of the book. And they were there. And I met them all. And they came to my garage. And I had a register in my garage with Mr. Edison's and Mr. Ford's and all their signatures in my register when they came in every morning for 30 days and said, what are we going to do today? And I reported to them. I told them, I said, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And they'd come the next day and say, what happened? And you'd exchange opinions. And if they thought that they could help you, that you were wasting time, they would make a suggestion. Well, why don't you try this, Joe? Or why don't you try that? What a wonderful school. What wonderful teachers. Nothing equal to that.
Joe?
Destiny.
Yeah.
Destiny.
You believe in destiny?
Lencki was there at the right time, in the right place, with the right people. But it's still there, and with the exception of the rules, they must change the rules, and we must control this polluting atmosphere that we have now, or we're going to have to, we'll be compelled to reduce the number of the automobiles. And there's going to be several ways that we can do it. Number one, use a material like I have to lubricate, control, and what have you. And the other would be to have sizes. Now, it'd be ridiculous to take a horse that wins the Kentucky Derby 2 weeks after the race and hitch him to a plow. And it'd be just as ridiculous to take a plow horse and put him in the loop of Chicago and do the work of what they have to do under those conditions and circumstances. So I honestly believe that as time goes on, we will have to control ourselves with the size, the weight, but we will have to do everything mechanically, design-wise, to control this pollution as quick as we possibly can. Because just think of what would happen, like I said before, we have 4 seasons a year. Now we have 4 seasons a week. Well, what would happen to our crops if after we plant our wheat and corn, if we had a frost the next day? And that's possible under these conditions. Nobody knows yet. Take a look at what's happening. The sun used to rise at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and we had it till sundown. Now the sun rises at noontime, maybe. And we don't know whether the rain is going to change the snow and ice before the day is over. And consequently, we're going to have to adjust ourselves. And I believe that if we can control this layer of pollution that we have, we can get back to normal again. And it is possible. But it's going to require cooperation, and it's going to require the support of the automobile owners. They're going to have to use materials like I have. They're going to have to use this Lencki to control. And they can control it. Nobody else can. They have to do it. We can do whatever we want in the laboratories. And if we do not get the cooperation of the operators, the people, and if they don't take our advice and the advice of the people that sold them the car, and principally, forget about car repairs. You don't need car repairs. Take care of car maintenance. Keep your cars like we keep our race cars, by inspecting them every day, like we do at the Speedway, and do the same thing with your automobile on the highway, and take it in and have the maintenance controlled, and the operation of it controlled, the performance of it controlled. How? Go to your car dealer. Go to your repair shop, automotive repair shop, and let them tell you to come in 30 days or 60 days, depending on how you're using that automobile, for what purpose. Do you have it in a garage, or do you have it out in the street? Where is the location of it? Is it out where the weather can get at it and have a great variable in the temperatures, or just a minimum amount of variable? But if you take care of the maintenance of that car, and if you cooperate with our American designers and builders, we'll control this atmosphere, and we can do it. But if the car owner, and if the man that's operating that thing doesn't cooperate, the laboratory, the engineers, the scientists can't do a thing for you.
Very good, Joe. Let me ask you, I'm going to mention one name, and I want to get your reaction on that, talking about this subject. Kittering.
I knew Charlie, and he and Al Sloan. Al Sloan was chairman of the board and president of the General Motors Corporation, retired, about 1920, 1922. Charlie Kittering was a scientist, and he was in petrochemistry, solid chemistry, and he come to Indianapolis, and he said, "Joe, what's your compression ratio?" I said, "Oh, I don't know." I said, I'd have to check. I said, "Probably 7.5, 8 to 1. He had a bomb in his hand. He had a welded container, probably a quart or more. He said, "Joe, 1 up to 12 to 1. I said, "What are you talking about, Charlie?" He said, "I got it." He said, "About 6 cc's, 6 cubic centimeters to 10 cubic centimeters to the gallon." And he said, "You can raise your pressure, your cylinder pressure, from 7, 8 to 1 to 12 to 1. And he was right. Well, for years, when you went into a garage or into a filling station and you wanted your gas tank filled, you said, "Fill her up." And the attendant said, "With or without?" "With or without what?" "Tetraethyl lead." "You want leaded gas?" They did that for 50 years. But they found that there was a great hazard in using it too. It polluted the air and was poisonous. And that's why you don't have. That's why they started to reduce it first. That's what's bringing on this pollution. 250 million automobiles. And we got to stop it.
Joe,
if we don't, it's going to be too bad.
You know, in closing this one session, I'd like to ask you a question that just keeps buzzing around in my mind. Joe Lencki, was he more car racer or more scientist?
I never did anything in my life for the monetary reward. All I ever was interested in the end result. And I found that there was no place in the world that was equal to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I could go to any college I desired to go because my father had the means, and he would be proud to have me go to MIT or to any of the leading colleges to get me the necessary education. But after I investigated, I couldn't find a better school in this world than the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Or better teachers.
That's right. Or better instructors and advisors. And they come right into my classroom. I didn't have to go to their classroom. And they all were there bunched for me. I didn't have to go looking for them and waste a lot of time like we do today in some of the things we do. We may waste more time to go someplace and all of the necessary requirements to get 15 minutes work done, and we take a week sometime to get there to even do that 15 minutes. All we're going to need is cooperation. And nothing in this world can affect the history of the world like the automobile. Because stop and think one thing. In this century, we put a man on the moon. And he came back. And when they sent him back for his second trip, what did he take with him out of this world to put on the moon?
He drove it.
A Jeep. An automobile.
That little
Jewel. You might want to start telling us how the name the pup. Where did that name come from?
Well, this pup here is the results of what we found and started to develop from 3 previous models. There were 3 cars before this one, and we called them the old dogs because this was the reproduction of and the pedigree that came from the 3 previous ones. There was changes made in the chassis design, the springing, and one very unusual thing that we have in this design here is that we can also change the wheelbase of it. The first and only time in the world's history that that could be done in a very few minutes. And that is because the extension on the front end here and the way the radius rods are attached to the frame of the car, it's possible to change this from 90 inches to 96 inches.
I see.
Now you may ask why and for what difference. Well, the why is that on the dirt, 90 inches, is, especially on the half-mile tracks, is the most suitable and the best to use. And at the speedway, because it's 2.5 miles around instead of a half-mile around, we found it to be safer and better to extend the wheelbase to 96 inches.
Okay, we're talking about the dimensions of the car. Let's start in the early 30s when you designed this car. Didn't you? Is this your car? Let's start about who designed the car and built the body.
I designed the car, and
Okay, hold that thought. I'm going to change the camera angle. You mentioned six. A hand left. No. Action.
Okay, Joe, let's start from your first race car. When did you build the first car?
the first car was built about late in 22, early 23, and it had a Miller frame, and it had an Offy engine in it, a Model T Ford with an Offy rocker arm head on it, and it was a beautiful appearing automobile. However, its appearance was such that the promoters liked it, wanted it, and everything else from a grandstand point of view and from attraction. However, its performance was lacking in many, many ways. So it had a strange history. That car, I drove that car at that time, and I only drove it for about one season when I exchanged my driving desires with my mechanical and my development desires for a very good reason. My mother wanted me to make up my mind. She said, you can't do both and make your choice because you're going to get hurt. And I agreed with her.
I understand your mother was very adamant pertaining to a certain race in Springfield, Illinois.
Yes, she was. But this first car, I drove the car in a race at Detroit on the mile track there, and I drove a Model T 25-mile-an-hour flatbed truck all the way up to Detroit all night, and then had to get out of the truck cab and get into the cockpit of the race car, qualify it, and start in a 100-mile race. However, I must have been lucky because I was running about third when I had to make my first pit stop. When I come into the pits, lo and behold, one of the famous race drivers at that time, Al Waters, was standing and waiting in my pit. And his car owner was Slim Heinley from Indiana. And he said, Joe, you're too tired. Why don't you get out of that car and let my boy get in, let Al get in and finish it. You're going to win the race, hands down. The car's got the performance. I don't think you can do justice to it. So I got out of the car, and Waters got in the car. So 2 laps, on the 3rd lap, Mr. Waters had a heart attack. And when he had this heart attack, coming out of the turn on the home stretch, he wasn't but a third down the home stretch when he hooked into the very heavy outside fence there and tossed that up in the air probably 25, 30 feet, and it fell on him. And it fractured his head to the extremes that his brain started to come out of his forehead. The car was totally destroyed, totally destroyed.
How did you feel about that, Joe?
Well, I felt very bad, but I felt relieved when I was told that it was not an accident, it was a heart attack. If the car was the reason and the cause of it, I'd have felt very bad. But there was no failure on the car's part. There was no failure on the driver's selection. He had a natural cause. He had a heart attack. And that was the medical and what have you report on it.
Okay, now you don't have a race car, Joe. What did you do next? What was the next move?
Well, after we destroyed that one, because of my commitments and my contracts and what have you, I had to have a car immediately so that I could fulfill my contracts. And I then made arrangements and bought one of the fastest half-mile race cars in the world at that time, Sonny Talamon's car. And its record speaks for itself. I bought Talamon's car, and while I'm racing it and earning what I had to earn and my keep, we started building the second car, my car. And we then started the design and what have you, and the second car, we too lost that one in an accident.
Where did that happen, Joe?
The second accident was at, I think at Roby. And
Roby, that's the famous track that was on the southeast side of Chicago.
Just outside, just across the limits into Indiana.
Calumet
East.
City?
That's right, in that area there. Very famous track. It was one of the most famous racing tracks, I would say, next to Indianapolis.
That was
almost
a 1 mile
a
dirt.
1 mile dirt track. And it attracted most of the speedway, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway drivers and their cars would run in 1 or 2 races at Roby before they'd go to Indianapolis. Mostly the ones that came from all over the United States, from the Pacific Coast and what have you, that participated in the 500.
Okay,
So,
getting back to your second car, the one that you were talking
well,
about.
the second car, it performed very, very well, and I did not, that's when I was replaced with my driving desires, and I had to go to my mechanical. I made up my mind that I would rather do a mechanical work in preference to the driving. And I got a driver by the name of Morris, D.D. Morris. And
Stop there. Hold that thought. Okay, rolling. Ready. Action.
Okay, Joe, tell us about D.D. Morris. You mentioned before quite a driver, and in your second car, he was one of your drivers.
well, D.D. Morris was, his record speaks for itself. I mean, if no accidents or any causes, not his, but other participants, he won. And his record is, well, it's almost unbelievable. In 1926, we started in 900 and 150-mile races, 3A races, championship races, and lo and behold, a guy run 5 firsts and 4 seconds in 9 starts, which is almost unbelievable.
That's great.
And the car, the performance of the car, and he fit that car perfect. As I say, he was almost unbeatable. And he was that way for several years. I mean, he just, we had a wonderful 26, 27, and 28, and right on, I would say, at the end of 28, and then the pup was born.
Okay, tell us. So now you got rid of the 2 dogs, and now this was the pup.
That's right. And And what I was doing was taking all of the performance records and of the track conditions, atmospheric and otherwise, and putting them into the pup. There were certain things about the other cars that could be improved upon, and this was supposed to be and proved to be, by performance, to be the masterpiece. There is no racing car in the world today, and this is, you know, what century and what. We're 75 years later. No car in the history of automobile racing comes close to the records of this automobile. This car set so many records on half-mile and mile tracks. It had so many different drivers in it. And without exception, each and every driver was very, very well fitted, was satisfied, and the performance of it was unbelievable in its whole record.
Excuse me, Joe, let's talk about that design. When you built this car, I was impressed with this wooden form, this kick-up. Why don't you explain us briefly?
Well, that's a wood pattern,
Okay.
and that's used to make a steel form. And this frame on this car is, again, extremely unusual. This is not a U frame, it's a box frame.
Okay.
It's a square box frame. Why and how to make it stiff, well supporting, and yet light. No other frame on any race car, even today, has this kind of design of frame.
How did you make that in those early days? How did you do that?
Well, we had these patterns made here, and we'd start with a channel, a piece of 10-gauge steel suitable to make the frame out of.
Okay.
And you'd form and bend it, and I had that done by Floyd Dreyer in Indianapolis. Floyd Dreyer was a famous body and chassis builder, racing body and chassis builder, and I told him what I wanted, gave him the prints and the drawings and what have you, and we had these patterns made so that when you start with a flat piece of 10-gauge material, steel, and you lay that down, and then he has to form it. Well, when you get to the back end of it, for this kick-up, for the spring kick-up on the back, you can't do it on both sides to be in line and to be suitable. So we had to make this pattern. Now what you do, you bolt that onto the box channel,
I see.
and it's metal, heavy metal, and you heat it, and then they hammer the flat stock over this piece of metal.
They hand forged it
That's
over
right.
it. I see.
They hand form it right over it, and that's what the kick-up is about. However, the unusual part of this frame is not only that it's the stiffest and only one of a kind. It's a box channel. It's just like a tube, but it isn't a tube. But it has all the stability, the stiffness, light, and yet every desirable feature, and it's not tubular. It's a box channel. Now, the unusual part of this chassis here, this frame, is that you can change the length of it, and it's only, I think, last year, Mercedes-Benz made a claim that they announced that they had made a car that has a variable wheelbase.
And you,
Well,
in fact, were the first one that did this.
well, it did this in 1930. A few years later, this is what? You know, it ain't 1930.
Okay, Joe, why don't we talk a little about some of the specifications of the car. You said the wheelbase was 96 inches?
96 inches for Indianapolis,
For
because
Indianapolis.
that was what the rules required.
Okay.
And 90 inches for half-mile and dirt track racing, and you could make it variable over that 6 inches. You could make it 92, 94, or 96.
And the engine, there's a clutch behind the engine, and you have a transmission. Is that a 2-speed forward with reverse transmission?
It's 3-speed.
3-speed?
Yes, it is 3-speed, and it has a reverse in it. It has a starter. On it. And this particular engine is an Offenhauser engine, a very famous at that time engine, and up until probably I'd say 1949 at Indianapolis, from 1930 to 1949, one of the most popular. Well, as you well know, I designed my own engine in the early 30s. I started to design my own engine, and however...
That point is cut right there. I started to design my own engine.
Here's where we get the engine now. Rolling.
Action.
Okay, Joe, let's talk a little about the cockpit here of the pup. I understand this steering wheel is very famous, and maybe you can elaborate on the instrumentation of the car.
The cockpit and the seating arrangement.
Play. Complete. Rolling.
Rolling.
Action.
Okay, Joe, let's talk a little about the cockpit in the pup here, and you can explain this very famous steering wheel and some of the other instrumentation.
The cockpit and the seating arrangement on a racing car, if you want top performance on a dirt track where you're going through the sharp turns and what have you, we had safety belts, and the driver fits tight in. The cockpit has to be designed for the particular driver. And if you need replacement, you have to be very careful that they're both the same size, the same weight and everything else, or they'll be out of focus what this thing was designed to be. Now,
And the steering wheel now.
this steering wheel here is a very, very famous steering wheel. This wheel, it's a gift that I received from a promoter that owned the Golden Egg, the Barney Oldfield famous golden submarine race car that raced at Indianapolis. And he was kind enough to give me this because a famous race car had to have a famous steering wheel on it. Now, a very unusual thing about this steering wheel here is this button here.
What is that button?
Well, it's not a horn button.
No, it's not a horn.
That's right. This is a ground switch that you had the shut-off switch up here, but this switch here, in the event of any emergency, the driver, all he has to do is hold his finger on this thing and he stops the car immediately and stops the engine.
Did that shorten the magneto out?
Yes, it does. It shortens the magneto
And
out.
your instrumentation here, Joe, I
Well-
notice you got a fuel pressure gauge here, and you've got an oil pressure gauge here, and a temperature gauge. Is that basically the three
That's
gauges?
yes, and in long races, now shorter races, we could use that, or for testing and for setting the car up. I usually remove all of this because it's always, when you shake up and what have you, it's possible to put yourself out of a race because of a very delicate instrument. But you don't need that.
And this choke knob here, something like a choke knob, was this for a retard to start the engine?
Yes,
Magneto?
that is the ignition control. You retard it for
And
starting.
here's your hand pump, and explain us just briefly.
The hand pump on this, in order to start, this has a pump, a fuel pump on it.
Yes.
And it's mechanical, and it's an aircraft engine fuel pump. However, you put a little pressure on your fuel tank here in order to start the car. And after you do, you relieve that. You've got to relieve a mechanism on there so that you can just turn it off and relieve it.
And you have a normal clutch pedal and
Yeah, you have
accelerator.
Yeah, you have the accelerator.
Your brake lever is right out here.
That's
outside.
right. You don't have a foot brake on these cars.
And here's the knob for the shift down in here.
Yes, that's the shifter.
And the drive shaft and the universal joint is right there between the driver's leg.
That's right. That's right. And this whole cockpit and everything fits a driver very much like the saddle equipment on a fine racing horse for the Kentucky Derby.
I see.
And that's if they have to have comfort for an animal, for a horse, you require a little more here because the horse is going 30 miles an hour and this thing is going 100 miles an hour. So that's right. The requirement, if it's important to do that with a horse, it must be that much more important with an automobile.
Cut. Okay, cut.
Action.
Okay, Joe, let's
Oh,
open.
wait, I'm sorry. I'm not, okay, rolling. Action.
Okay, Joe, let's look at the interesting part of your car here. Let's open the hood up. Joe, I see an Offenhauser engine in there. Can you explain why?
Yes, the only way that I can get satisfactory comparisons with my engine is it has to be in my car. Because if my car is the difference, then I don't learn anything about the engine performance. So consequently, since I am concentrating and most of my work is on engines, I'm interested. That's one purpose and one reason. But principally, my engine that I have in this car and that this car was designed for was the hemispherical combustion chamber with 2 valves per cylinder.
That's the Joe Lencki 4-cylinder engine.
That's right.
Okay.
And it is much smaller than this. This engine here is 255 cubic inches, 4 1/4 bore, 4 1/2 inch stroke, and it has a pent roof combustion chamber with 4 valves per cylinder like your modern cars have today. Mine, the small was a much smaller engine. This is 255 cubic inches. My engine is only 183 cubic inches.
I see.
And it only has 2 valves per cylinder because it has a hemispherical combustion chamber and has very large single intake valve and single exhaust valve. And I want to make comparisons to make sure what is making the difference in performance. Is it engine or is it car? And if I use the same engine, well, then I'm getting all car performance. And if I use engine and mix it up with another car, there is no comparison.
I see.
So there's a specific reason for doing that.
Can you tell us about that performance differential between your 183 cubic inch and this Offenhauser 255?
Well,
What did you find out, Joe?
I found that my little hemispherical engine, for dirt track purposes, has an advantage because the torque and that little engine, that 183 cubic inch engine, is greater than what this 255 cubic inch is. Oh yes, this has a 4 1/16 bore, 4 1/2 inch stroke, and that little engine had a 3 3/4 bore and a 4 inch stroke. And yet the torque differential was amazing. It was amazing how much difference it made. And the little engine was probably about at least 50 pounds lighter than this engine. But this is a very, very interesting engine because it's not just an Offenhauser engine. This engine here is number 4 Offenhauser engine, and he built hundreds of them.
And this is number 4?
This is number 4 engine, and this particular design and model of this Offenhauser probably won at least a dozen and a half 500-mile races in Indianapolis.
Joe, our audience would like to know about this engine. What is this?
That's the fuel pump, and it's a fuel pump that's commonly used on all aircraft engines. It's a geared pump, and you can change the pressure on it, and it fits the performance requirements very, very well.
Okay, let's follow that the fuel system. I notice we have two carburetors here. Can you explain us who made these carburetors and how they function?
They're a very, very, very good friend of mine and an extraordinary man in the automotive profession and business, Ed Winfield. And he's from La Cañada, California. He has a little laboratory there. And Ed not only made probably the finest carburetors in the world, but he also was an artist, and a very, very extremely extraordinary required component in any automobile is his camshafts. Ed could grind camshafts like some of the...
Okay, Joe, and going over the integral parts of this engine, what is this?
That's the fuel pump.
Okay. And...
Well, you can go into this.
Okay. Okay, rolling. Okay, Joe, tell us about this Offenhauser engine. Let's start over here with this. What is this here, Joe?
That's a fuel pump. Now, the fuel pump, as you may see, is driven off of the camshafts. In this side of this, inside of this housing here, are the two camshafts. These camshafts control and they open and close the valves that enter into the combustion chamber. Now, there's two intake valves and two exhaust valves in each combustion chamber in this thing. And they're ample. This right here is the manifold, the intake manifold. And these are the carburetors. They're Winfield carburetors. They feed the air that enters through here and the fuel that goes through these carburetors. They're properly adjusted for the fuel-air ratio requirements and enter the engine through this manifold here. Now, when they do that, they go in there, and what lets it, allows it to pass into the combustion chamber, the camshafts. The camshafts and the valve mechanism. These camshafts open and close the valves that are in this combustion chamber at a specific time, keep them open and closed at specific times, and that's what allows this thing to function the way it is. It's an internal combustion reciprocating engine. That means it has pistons in it, and your vertical static motion turns to revolving motion when the connecting rods inside this engine connect to the crankshaft and creates the rotating motion that's required to move the automobile.
All right, tell us about the spark. How is the spark delivered to the spark plugs up here, Joe?
The spark is created by this magneto. It is a magneto. It's not a battery ignition. It's self-sustaining and self-energizing. By rotation, it creates the amount of energy required to go through these cables and go into the spark plugs. The spark plugs in this engine are right in the center of the combustion chamber, which is the proper place to have them, because the flame travel is always from the center, and it's the most positive timing that you can have. For what reason? It controls the fuel efficiency that you have in the particular design of the engine. And it creates the least amount of pollution because it burns more of the fuel inside the cylinder, inside the combustion chamber, than you ordinarily do with a passenger automobile. And since this was 1930, this was very early with this particular kind of design. However, the design of your modern engine today, not 1930, but today, is almost the same as this is in the 1930 engine. First race, Lakewood Speedway, Atlanta, Georgia, mile track. First race it run, Johnny Sawyer sets a track record the first time he qualifies it. He wins the helmet dash, wins the feature, and he's got the lady that won the beauty contest from Georgia and the next beauty.
All right, what we'll do then after that, you name a few tracks that you remember this car ran at. DuQuoin, Milwaukee, talk about...
No, stay right there in the Atlanta area there. Tupelo, Mississippi, Richmond and them kind. They no longer make them anymore, okay? And you know who did it? About 4,000 ladies that were working with me, not for me, with me, putting them engines together. We never lost one out of pretty close to 25,000 in the Dodge Chicago plant here.
The Enola Gay, the airplane that...
Yeah, to drop the firecrackers, yeah.
dropped the
And
atomic bomb on Japan.
the boxcar. There was 8 of my engines in there, my engines, that my ladies put together for me. All I did was stood there and just made sure that they didn't leave the breathers off. That was my job, to see that no breathers was left off. That's my history.
Well, you can trust those ladies.
I did, and they never missed. You know why? Because they were the mothers, they were the aunts, they were the wives of the boys that were flying them. I saw to that too. That was a part of my job.
So your job was to put those engines together, safe, sound.
No, I didn't put them together. They put them together. It was my job to make damn sure that they didn't leave the breathers off or any other part off, that they'd get there and come back. And thank God they did. Never missed a one. They had to shoot them down. They didn't fall down.
So the American woman really was the one that contributed to the great success in Japan.
They certainly did. There's no question about that. There's no question about that. And they know it. They know it. When I say they, I can tell you some intimate things that I did there that they thought this madman is a wild man. I even had a lady there to check and give me specific time on the menstrual periods of them women. Why? Because they have a acid condition, and when they handled them beautiful brown parts in there, they would stain them with their acid, and we used to have to take them off of the line for a couple of days until they wouldn't have that condition.
They were that finely honed. That was how delicate and precise.
They all
everything
are. They are in here too. If I had any ladies working on these, I'd have to have a lady here that'd keep a record on the menstrual periods. Yeah.
And Joe, then every time this car here raced, you had to treat it as if it were the precision instrument it is.
It's a part of me.
Right.
It's a part of me. When you do something to this, it's like this pacemaker I got here. If it isn't right, 100% right, it's a failure. I'll be a failure. Take the pacemaker off, I may be dead tomorrow morning.
Joe, when these drivers got into this car, you had to make sure that it was A1, absolutely ready for that race. Who are some of these men?
Oh, probably some of the most prominent drivers in the history of racing in America. We'd start with the man that was on the firing line with this, Johnny Sawyer from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Johnny's reputation speaks for itself, and Johnny was an outstanding dirt track driver. And like I say, we went to Atlanta there, and the first trip that he made in this car, new track record for qualifying, track records, won it all. And what did he get? He was kissing and hugging the lady that won the beauty contest for Georgia that time. And check the records, it's there.
What year?
Oh, God, what year? 1930. A couple of hours after this car was finished in Indianapolis, it wasn't even painted. We left Indianapolis, Floyd Dryers, with the finished car, with the new chassis and everything, and it didn't have this engine in it. It had my little 4-cylinder engine in. However, this car right out of the box. It was perfect, absolutely perfect. And we stayed there for, 3.5, 4 months in that area there, in the Florida, Mississippi, Virginia, and then that whole area there.
What are the drivers?
Well, no, not drivers, driver at that time.
Yeah, the dogs had drivers.
Johnny Sawyer, that time, he was alone. However, after, and this, mind you, is the first race, the first crack out of the box. And this is my first inspection tour and my evaluation of what we did when I designed this thing and started to race it. What it was better, what it was needing, and worse, and I made my comparison. There was very, very little you could do to this thing. It was almost perfect right from the beginning. Now, when you asked about drivers, well, the car went all over the United States, with the exception of the Pacific Coast. It raced from New York to the capital of South Dakota, Huron, South Dakota. We made a trip from old Massachusetts all the way to Huron, South Dakota for one race. And this same Sawyer was there. He qualified the car, another new track record. Check the records. Don't check my mouth. Check the records. Set a new track record, won all the races, and all the way back to Massachusetts. I'm living in Chicago. We haven't got time for me to even visit with my wife for an hour. We went right by Chicago and bypassed it and went back because I had a race the next day. And who are the drivers? Oh, Sawyer was the top driver, Jimmy Snyder, Floyd Davis, Connors, and well, you can go down the roster and name this
What
car.
about the great Bettenhauser?
This car here had probably 50 racing drivers, prominent racing drivers that were driving racing cars at Indianapolis, and here that drove this car and were in it. Emil Andrews, Duke Nayland, well, go on down the list.
Bettenhausen.
Bettenhausen had his first ride in a championship car. Bettenhausen was a midget driver and never had any experience. His first trip in this car was at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I tried to coach him, and you couldn't coach Mr. Bettenhausen. He was uncoachable. So he drove too hard into the first turn and lost the car and went off the track. Fortunately, he did not damage it. So I went, inspected the car, and I said, get your butt back in here, and let's get it back into the pit so I can give it a thorough inspection. I did, and it was all right. It wasn't harmed. He qualified the car, I don't remember, probably third, fourth position. His first race was a number 6, number 7 finish. 2 weeks later, we go to Syracuse, New York. Same car, Bettenhausen. New York State Fair, Syracuse. He gets in the car, qualifies it, front row, starts in the race, and not because of his fault, but because a stone sheared the brake line on the front end of this, and no brakes from half of the race, finished second, and his second attempt and the second time this car run at Syracuse.
Without brakes.
Without brakes.
That's a driving.
And he was beat there by Rex Mays, who was the most prominent race driver in the country at that time. And he'd have beat him if he'd have had brakes.
Who were some of your sponsors in those days, Joe?
I had them all. I had them all because I was doing engineering, petrochemical research for them, and my original sponsor was the Bird Piston Ring Company of Rockford. And then from there, the Borg Warner Corporation, and they supply clutches, transmissions, and various component parts of automobiles for everybody, for General Motors, Chrysler, and all of them, not one. And Republic Steel, they furnished all the materials for it. The steel that was used for the connecting rods and the crankshafts and the piston pins and the valves and all the other component parts of it. And Thompson Products, valve springs, forged screw pistons, Blue Crown spark plug, the spark plugs did it. You name them, I had them all.
What about that famous, now famous radio announcer that announced some of the races? A man by the name of Ronald Reagan.
Well, that's a little before this time. That doesn't. Reagan, I met Ronnie in Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa. He was employed by the World's Amusement Company as the announcer, the race announcer, in that area, and he graduated from there. But Ronnie was a nice boy, and he was a good boy, and he developed fast. I mean, he was very, very good. In fact, he was excellent in his job, and he left automobile racing and went to work for the radio broadcasting station there. That was his next job. He jumped, he hurdled everything, and from there he went into the movies, and he had them 2 jobs. Oh, a very important one. He also worked announcing for one of our baseball. I don't know if it's the Sox or the Cubs, but he put in a couple announcing trips here for either the Sox or the Cubs. Check the records and you'll find that I'm pretty accurate.
Joe, one thing, the difference between speedway testing and lab testing.
They're unrelated. Laboratory testing is valuable and can be used for designing purposes. Elementary, I mean, the fundamental, and you stop right there. Because you don't drive an automobile into a laboratory. You don't put it in a glass case. You're out in the atmosphere, and probably never will. That's the difference between Lencki, okay? That's why I went to the Speedway. I could have went to Caltech. I could have went to Purdue. I could have went to Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Hi, Val. How are you?
I could have gone to all of them.
Look who's here.
You know why she's here?
Why?
Because she's going to put the collar and chain on me. She wants to make sure I'm not going to lose control.
And I am late. Can you imagine?
No, well, he's not lost control yet, except that we did have a problem with the,
Oh, Joseph, you're such a star. Oh, you look good.
Are you satisfied?
I am.
Well, thank you. What?
See, you got that beautiful sparkle in your eye.
That was great stuff. That was really good stuff. We didn't even know that we were taking.
You're taking it?
Yeah, we took all that.
Oh, yeah.
Holy Christ.
Well, no, you did a perfect job. You did a perfect job. Well, what do you think they were doing?
I was talking to him.
that's right.
Yeah.
I was talking to him.
Ed, we got into the speedway versus lab, and he's saying it perfect, because what he's saying is they're both important, but you've got to get out in the element, and that's crucial.
This is the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
And I want to get into the alma mater. Let's get in.
Listen to this one thing. Listen to this one thing. And this is a fact. The 20th century, the first half of the 20th century will go down in history as the most productive in the history of the world, with one exception. The only thing that didn't happen in the first half of the 20th century here in America is Jesus Christ wasn't born here. And with that exception, go right to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Automobiles, airplanes, electric lights. It was done all at the Speedway, at my college, at my school. That's why I went there. I made that choice in 1911 when I was 8 years old.
Fantastic. Let's get back to Speedway and lab testing.
Well, they're unrelated. The fundamentals can be done in a laboratory, but the finals cannot. It's the preliminary preparatory examination. When you get to the finals, then you have to do it where it's done. It can be perfect in the laboratory, and it's all out of order and practical use. And like I said, you don't operate that engine in a laboratory. You don't drive that car in a laboratory. Before I start an engine up, I warm it up to atmospheric and to its operational temperature. It's warmed up. I don't warm it up with the engine. I warm it up with whatever heating requirements it requires to operation to 180 degrees. And then I start it. Why? Because that's what it was designed and used for. Not to be ice cold or warm or overheated. And I do that to protect it. You can't do them things in a laboratory. It wasn't made to do that. However, that's operational conditions. That's what you, the man that buys the automobile, that's what you, the man that buys and uses and trusts that you can take off safely with an aircraft engine that's going to get you off the ground and put you down at the most crucial and at the time where you demand the most out of it. Not when you're up there 15,000, 18,000 feet. It's when you're on the ground. If you get off of that ground and get into flight position, you're safe. That's the most hazardous and dangerous time for that engine. Forget about the passengers, for that engine. And you can't do that in a laboratory. You have to do it either on a flying field or you have to do it at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And the Indianapolis, the four gentlemen that bought, designed, and built that thing were geniuses. They were geniuses.
That was your school.
Yes, yes. And my doors were wide open. A bug-eyed boy, 1911, 8 years old. And who do I meet? I meet two of the greats. I meet a guy by the name of Johnny Jenkins, who was a race driver and later became automotive editor of the Chicago Daily News, and Dawson, Joe Dawson. He didn't win in 1911 for me. I had to wait another year when I come back there in 1912. Then he won the 1912 race. And you know something? When that guy met me and Johnny Jenkins met me, the bug-eyed kid, they picked me up in their arms because I was just as mouthy then as I am now and put me in the car. They picked me up and put me in the car. And when I went back there the next race, I got pictures with Mr. Dawson, and I shouldn't say I got them. They had pictures made of me, and we became very, very friendly. And not only that, I showed my gratitude because about, maybe 10, 12 years later, Dawson, the man that finished second, and Jenkins, that finished about seventh, check the records, 1912, 500-mile race, Indianapolis in the end. But Dawson wanted to be a distributor of piston rings and Hades hot water heaters, and the Bird Pistonry Company was one of my sponsors. Made to order. Destiny. Made to order. He said, okay, Joe, I'll introduce you to the old man, to Mr. White, president of the company. you're a distributor right now, I promise you. And he did. He became a distributor.
So from 1911 to the present, Indianapolis has been your university.
Still is. I haven't got my diploma yet. I'm going there on the 18th of May. I don't know why it took 45 years for them to give me my diploma. I graduated in 1946 at my school, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But for some unknown reason, I didn't get the paper yet. But I'm going to get it. They promised me, and they asked me to be present on the 18th, I think the 18th of May, when they're going to give me my diploma. And then in my way, I'm going to try to show my gratitude what I'm going to do there at that time. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book in detail on what the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is, what it does, and what it has done, and the important part it played in the history of the world.
Que vamos a comenzar cerca a su cara.
This is de modo que, ok, Raúl, ok, empieza con la cara. Vamos a hacer un ejercicio aquí, un ejemplo. Y estamos concentrando en el hombre.
Okay. Well, let him just go. Let him go.
Okay.
You're okay, Joe. Just do what I said.
tell
Just
me
go
what
through.
it-
Okay.
tell me what
I
it's
want
over.
you. Okay, Joe.
You got it.
Okay, come on. Keep on coming. Keep on rolling. Keep on coming. Very good.
That was great.
Very good.
Good.
We can edit
Very
that down
good.
into something very, very
Isn't that dramatic?
I'm gonna go from the back of the car all the way to the front of the
Saw
car.
the breather holes.
I know.
It's a wonder you didn't go.
The breather's off.
I was expecting him to bite the damn hood.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There never will be another automobile in the history of the world. It's going to be maybe equal, but it'll never be better than that automobile.
I believe that.
Any way you want to compare it, piece for piece, with one exception. It's got the wrong brakes on it,
And the breathers are on.
and the breathers are on, but it's got the wrong brakes on it. And the brakes,
Over there.
well, they're in a box. They should be on the car. They're in a box. But the only reason why they're on there, comparison. Okay? Take them off, put the other ones on, and see about laboratory.
Right.
You ain't gonna drive a laboratory, are you? You're gonna drive the automobile.
What is that?
Whole thing, he's got it thought out from A to Z in his mind. And it's going to be, when we finally get to the lab, he's going to have fantastic.
We'll get this Offenhauser thing here.
Yeah. Sí. No, nada.
Watch this. Just watch this. I told you, I promise you, they open up.
We're set here.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
So what do you think of all this, Val?
It needs
It's a lot of work.
It needs that entry over there.